This podcast is recorded primarily in Stratford, Ontario. Stratford is on the territory of the Anishinaabe Wakim, Atidawanderong Neutral, and Mississauga's land. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, notably the Huron Tract Purchase. This new business acknowledges this history of the land and strives to be an ally to the Indigenous peoples of Canada, who have suffered through systemic racism, causing intergenerational trauma. I urge you to be aware of the path of truth and reconciliation that is ongoing in this country, which was fought for in the largest class action lawsuit against the Canadian federal government. Stemming from this lawsuit, thousands of children have been discovered buried at residential schools, the last of which closed in 1996. This podcast is not sponsored yet. It's in its infancy, pure and yet to be monetized. Regardless, I promise to never allow ads to detract from the fantasy football fun and analysis on the show. If you're listening and you have a business in need of advertising, maybe you should consider a new and meteoric rising podcast. To settle and assuage any doubts, here's a sample. Did you know that 1 in every 4 Canadians suffer from one of the many devastating symptoms of goose-related mania? These sassy and hissing wonders of the water are quite grumpy, as I can personally attest to, and are responsible for the raised heart rates of millions of Ontarians this year already. Not for long, though. For the low, discounted price of $9.99 plus tax, this will no longer be a source of stress in your life. With no loose goose, spritz and spray. Spray it on yourself, and your goose invisible. Spray it in front of you, the goose will cease hissing with amazement, losing interest. I do not advertise for products I do not endorse, O Nation, and no loose goose has the O-Dog verbal stamp of approval. O-Dog out. Before we jump in, please review and follow this podcast on your podcast service. Select that little plus button at the top of your phone to follow, and then scroll down a little bit to leave a rating and a review. That'd be swell. And if you have some fun with your review, I'll even read it on the podcast. In the future, being a follower, rater, and reviewer may just earn you a free signed jersey. Stay tuned. Also on that topic, please like and follow this podcast on Facebook, 1&0 Fantasy Football, or at 1&0 Fantasy Football. Also on Twitter, at 1&0 Fantasy, and on Instagram, at 1&0 Fantasy Football. Note, 1&0 is not 1&0 with an OH. It's 1&0 with just the O, and that's me. I'll pause here for a moment and wait for you to like and follow on the socials. Did you do it? You know that there's a pause button right there, right? Want to know on 3? 1, 2, 3.
Want to know?
And bonjour. You're listening to the official 1&0 Fantasy Football Podcast. It's time to join your host, the commissioner extraordinaire, the fantasy football trademonger, Owen O-Dog Drake.
Welcome to 1&0 Fantasy Football, where you're the 1 and I'm the O. Today, the 1 is also my girlfriend and partner, the 1 and the only, Caitlin Johnson, as she and I discuss the Deshaun Watson saga and its NFL roster conclusion, while the court proceedings and looming NFL investigation and seemingly inevitable suspension remain ongoing. Before we begin the interview, I want to acknowledge the nature of the content we are about to discuss. The Deshaun Watson saga is anything but a comfortable topic. But it's one that I've decided to discuss, as in 2022, we need to be talking about and learning from events such as this. And it will be a topic that impacts the NFL, its fans, and even fantasy football. As a disclaimer, this topic contains graphic references to sexual assault. And I have brought in Kate for the interview of this topic, as, in my opinion, it wouldn't be right to omit a female perspective when discussing issues of this nature. This topic is a reminder that sports isn't simply a distraction from the issues of life, where the same horribleness exists. Please note that everything we discuss after presenting the facts and the timeline are our own opinions. The plan was to bring Kate into this podcast experience as a beginner into the world of the NFL and, more succinctly, fantasy football. And with this story, circumstances have obviously changed. We will talk soon about her journey into the world of the NFL, her favorite team choice, and fantasy football in general in the coming episodes. But for now, let's hit the preamble so we can enter our interview understanding the context of this complex and seemingly ever-changing saga.
Almost 24 women and one quarterback.
Before I begin and outline the history of Deshaun Watson in the NFL and in fantasy, I want to make sure to note that everyone should do their own research and draw their own opinions on this controversial topic. I'd like to reference the excellent work of Jenny Vrentas, who reported as a senior writer at Sports Illustrated before joining the New York Times, as well as Sarah Barshop, an ESPN staff writer who covered the timeline of events leading to the Browns' acquisition of Watson. To begin this preamble and to provide the context for the Deshaun Watson interview with Kate, let's rewind back to the 2017 NFL Draft. In 2017, there is no consensus number one quarterback. It's well known that Myles Garrett will go number one to the Cleveland Browns, and he's an absolute wrecking ball of a defensive end. We won't get into his own controversy that occurred a couple of years ago, but a generational talent at pass rusher nonetheless. In this draft, Mitchell Trubisky, Patrick Mahomes, and Deshaun Watson would end up being the three quarterbacks selected in the first round. The Bears, after inviting their heralded new quarterback, Mike Glennon, to their draft party, trade up for a quarterback for Mitchell Trubisky. After this, the Chiefs trade up for Mahomes, and the Texans trade up for Deshaun Watson, as these things often go during the first round of the NFL drafts for teams needing quarterbacks. From what I can remember of my pre-draft learning process, the podfather, Matt Kelly, noted on the Roto Underworld podcast that Watson had the slowest average throw velocity they'd ever charted. So as a Colts fan, I was happy that the Texans took him at this time. It's also important to note that Watson was and is on the football field, that is, a winner. Coming off a national championship, he was dubbed the guy at the most important position for the Texans. In his rookie year, he would start 6 games, throwing for nearly 1,700 yards and 19 touchdowns to 9 interceptions. And he finished as the quarterback 27 per Fantasy Pros in only those 6 games. In his second and third seasons, he took the Texans to the playoffs, where in 2018, the Indianapolis Colts embarrassed him and the Texans 21-7 in the wild card round. Go Colts. And where in 2019, he led his team to an overtime victory over the Bills, then succumbed to the Kansas City Chiefs and Mahomes in the divisional round, 51-31. Talk about some points in that game. Back to fantasy, though, in 2018 and 2019, during these seasons, Watson would finish as the quarterback number 4 and the quarterback number 5 overall in fantasy per Fantasy Pros. Before the 2020 season, Watson's number 1 target, DeAndre Hopkins, was traded to Arizona for washed running back David Johnson and a second-round pick, a paltry sum for the best wide receiver in football. However, during that season in 2020, Watson threw for over 4,800 yards and 33 touchdowns, both current career highs, and he would go on to finish as the quarterback 5 again in fantasy per Fantasy Pros. This illustrates how good of a fantasy football asset Watson was and is as a quarterback. He's a dual threat quarterback, dangerous with his arms and his legs. And for most of the years, he was paired with the best wide receiver in football, DeAndre Hopkins. He then signed a 4-year, $156 million contract extension, becoming the second highest paid player of all time behind, you guessed it, Patrick Mahomes. The beginning of Watson's displeasure in Houston was coach Bill O'Brien. During the 2020 season, Billy O'Brien was finally fired, which was sad for Colts fans. Loved seeing him destroy that organization. And Watson is quoted later in January saying that, quote, the Houston Texans organization needs a whole culture shift. Talk about a little bit of irony there. The Texans responded with hiring general manager Nick Caserio, who Watson did not want, and offered input on other candidates to no avail. Adam Schefter reported that since the Texans traded Hopkins, Watson's anger was at a 2. This time, it's a 10. By the end of January 2021, it is reported that Watson requested a trade weeks ago. And then roughly 2 weeks later, the team president resigns, stating he doesn't like the direction that the Texans are going. And 2 days after that, franchise icon J.J. Watt is released. A week later, Watson meets with new coach David Culley, where he tells him he wants to be traded and has no intention of playing another snap for the Texans. Roughly 1 month later, the first of 23 sexual assault lawsuits, one would later be dropped, are filed against Watson. Watson is accused of a range of inappropriate behavior towards massage therapists in the sexual assault lawsuits, including exposing himself, making the women touch him, ejaculating onto them, and more. Watson tweets that he rejected a, quote, baseless 6-figure settlement demand and, quote, this is about clearing my name, and I look forward to doing that. Thus began the year-long saga of trying to trade Deshaun Watson while these civil suits are ongoing. At different points, there were many teams interested in acquiring Watson, most notably the Dolphins. And eventually, even criminal complaints were filed against Watson, which caused all trade interest to dry up, as a player in prison can't help your franchise. Then, on March 11th, 2022, it was reported that Deshaun Watson would not be criminally charged in Houston, a decision by a grand jury. All 9 cases were rejected. Watson called it, quote, a very emotional moment, and that he would work to, quote, rebuild his name. It's also notable that Watson invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and declined to answer questions during these civil depositions. This occurred 5 days before the opening of NFL's free agency on March 16th. So, enter free agency. Once the 32 teams knew that Watson wasn't going to prison, this is where the real story begins. Teams began lining up for the services of a quarterback with 22 civil sexual assault lawsuits to his name. The most notable teams included the New Orleans Saints, the Carolina Panthers, the Cleveland Browns, and the Atlanta Falcons. Oh, look, we got a special guest coming in. She's coming in hot.
Hey, Owen.
Hey, Kate, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. But before we get started, let's bring you in with a proper introduction. How's that sound?
That sounds great.
Introducing a woman on track to achieve her second degree to become a nurse after a Bachelor of Health Sciences with a minor in Rehabilitation Science. She's a lover of all dogs, kind to all humans. She's smart. She's funny. She's a new Indianapolis Colts fan. She's the love of my life, my girlfriend, my partner. It's Caitlin Johnson, everyone. Kate, how the hell are you?
I've never been better.
Even though we're about to talk about some controversial stuff, huh?
True, I guess that's not ideal, but I'm excited to be here.
But you're doing fine this Sunday afternoon, eh?
I sure am.
So now, normally, I'd ask guests to get their plugs in here, whether it be for a new business like Joel, following on Facebook and Twitter like Fusco, or even going to SoundCloud and YouTube like Josh. But Kate's a bit of a unique case. As I mentioned, she's going to be our newbie to the fantasy football realm, helping others to bridge the gap from where do I start to, okay, this makes sense. I can do this. To do this, we'll have her set up with her very own 1-0 fantasy football account, including email, Twitter, and obviously fantasy football accounts on one or various of the services, depending on how many I can convince her to join. So stay tuned for where to follow Kate's journey into fantasy football via social media. Kate, how's that sound?
It sounds great. I can't wait to dive into it.
Yeah. And for listeners, there will be a forthcoming listener league featuring Kate the Great. We'll start with dubbing you Kate the Great now. Maybe it's the Kate the Great squad, but regardless, the league will feature Kate, myself, and we're looking for other people that are relatively new to the fantasy football space to kind of have a investment in the league and learn about fantasy as we go. The prize will include a signed jersey and a monetary prize, as well as, maybe even being featured weekly on the podcast.
Oh, I hope I win.
Not if I have anything to say about that, Miss Johnson.
We'll see.
So yes, this all sounds great, Kate, but without further ado, let's hop into our interview centered around a topic that is not going to be going away anytime soon in the NFL or in fantasy football. Deshaun Watson. So let's begin with the lawsuit. Full disclosure, neither Kate or I are lawyers nor fluent in the ways of the law in the court, but these are the facts as we know them, the questions we have and our opinions. So, Kate, 22 civil allegations of sexual assault, 2 criminal cases, all against quarterback Deshaun Watson. How can this player be a tradable asset in the NFL?
Well, the short answer, like you stated earlier when you were giving his football history and stats, he's really good. So it's no wonder that he'd be sought after. Teams want to go to the Super Bowl and they want to win. That's the whole, end goal of the season. If they see that he's available, they're going to take advantage of adding this huge asset to their lineup. But I guess what it comes down to is it worth adding him to the team just for the potential Super Bowl, despite these allegations? I think that's when we know that the team cares more about winning than the quality of players they have representing their franchise.
I think you make some excellent points. And the NFL has a distinct history and correlation where the more talent you have and the more valuable you are to a franchise and the NFL brand, and as you mentioned, more valuable to the end goal of winning a Super Bowl, the more you can get away with, for lack of a better term, breaking the law.
Yeah.
One of these of note here is Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill is a huge player, a huge asset in both the NFL and the fantasy realm. This was a person that was accused of domestic assault in college, where he choked his pregnant girlfriend and punched her in the belly, and then was released, deservedly so, from the Oklahoma State University, not invited to the combine and wasn't expected to be drafted. But then in the 5th round, the Kansas City Chiefs proved this correlation true when they select Tyreek. A couple years down the road, 2019, Tyreek Hill is again under a police investigation for an injury involving his son, which is he's still with the same woman at the time, and his son suffers a broken arm. Hill was suspended indefinitely by the Chiefs at the time, but then it was reported that he wouldn't face charges. So 2 weeks later, the NFL also concludes it's not going to suspend Hill. So he is seemingly getting away with choking and punching his pregnant girlfriend, who then becomes his fiance, then breaks the child's arm, gets away with it entirely with no consequences at his job.
That's just not right.
No. So it stands to reason that even though there are 22 civil lawsuits against Watson, he's not going to jail. So teams are still going to be interested in his services.
Yep.
Yep. So, as a new football fan primarily, but also as a female and just a thoughtful, kind, and respectful human being, what do you think of these teams rolling out the proverbial red carpet for the services of Deshaun Watson?
Yeah. I mean, so how many people in the world, in the US, are football fans, and specifically fans of teams in the NFL? Millions. So if there's millions of people watching and listening to NFL news and the trades that are happening, I think that the NFL has the opportunity to use their huge voice to stand up against matters like this. But with Deshaun and, like you said, Tyreek and anyone else who's gone through anything like this, it doesn't seem like the NFL cares too much at all about standing up to these matters.
Yeah. And if I can cut in right here too, Kate. So during this offseason, you have reports coming out that Calvin Ridley, who stepped away from the Atlanta Falcons during the past season to focus on his mental health, little round of applause for that.
Definitely.
Break the stigma. Let's focus on our mental health. But while he's away on his mental health, he makes the curious decision to place a few bets on the Atlanta Falcons. And he's suspended for a full year. I don't expect Deshaun Watson to be suspended for this long. And you're right. It shows an organization, if we can call the NFL that doesn't really seem to care. They care more about the integrity of the game with the players betting on it, which is an important issue. Don't get me wrong, but the NFL is forming partnerships with all of these betting companies, and sports betting is this new and amazing and approved thing in society. Mm-hmm. Players still shouldn't be able to do it, and he should still be suspended. But a whole season, if Deshaun Watson gets less than that, come on.
Yeah. I know they're allegations, but I mean, would 23 women come forward together if these allegations are false? I have a hard time believing that many women are being untruthful. So back to the question, when the teams are rolling out the proverbial red carpet, I think that was my first time ever using that word in my life. So that's fun. For this man, makes it seem like the NFL isn't taking matters like this seriously. And it really just shows others that it's easy to get away with things like sexual assault, especially if you're a professional athlete. Honestly, the NFL is really just creating a breeding ground for these types of actions and only giving their athletes a slap on the hand as punishment.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it was reported that the work for these teams, and by these teams, we're referencing the main four. We've got the New Orleans Saints, we've got the Carolina Panthers, we've got the Atlanta Falcons, and we've got the Cleveland Browns. And we can see that that if we go back to last season, teams are wary of meeting the Texans' demands for 3+ first-round picks and more. But this year plus campaign was led by one of the most powerful agents in the league, David Mugoletta. And by the end of it, it can be argued that Mugoletta used this as an opportunity to show how powerful his reach is as an agent, to show other players that are in trouble with the law, who you mentioned, who to come to and who's going to get them out of this situation. And that by the end of all of this, his price went up. And then these teams are performing their due diligence on Deshaun Watson. But according to reports, this is just face-to-face meetings so they can look him in the eye and talk. What's this going to do? I don't know if you've seen it, Kate, but there's footage of the Deshaun Watson depositions floating around online, and it's chilling. He is 100% adamant that he did nothing wrong. And like you mentioned, there has to be some element of truth in these allegations by 23 people.
Yeah, there's definitely been times in the past where maybe someone makes an allegation against someone that it isn't true, and maybe they are looking for money or trying to take advantage of the situation. But like I said, with 22 or 23 women coming forward at the same time, it's just really hard to believe that all of them are false. Yeah.
And as soon as these 32 teams in the NFL, like, as I mentioned, as soon as these 32 teams in the NFL knew that Watson wasn't going to prison, and you can't play football in prison, as soon as the criminal cases are cleared, it didn't matter that there were and still are these 22 cases. He's going to play football at some point. The fans will eventually forget, and these teams are jumping at the opportunity. So in my opinion, shame on the Saints, shame on the Panthers, shame on the Falcons, shame on the Browns. And honestly, at this point, a little bit of shame on the Colts too.
Yeah.
Because per Adam Schefter, Houston declined Indianapolis's attempt to speak with Deshaun Watson per a source, but they don't reference the source. So we don't know how actually serious the Colts were. We know that they're desperate at quarterback. And I, for one, I'm never going to cheer for the Browns again. And I'm similarly uncomfortable with the Saints, Panthers, and Falcons. And as I mentioned, this extends to the Colts, who at least inquired. And it's not to the same level, but it's a strike against my fandom.
Yeah. I also think about the younger generations that are into or are getting into football. A lot of children and adolescents look up to professional athletes as role models, especially if they're into sports themselves and maybe they're someday hoping to be in the NFL themselves.
Yeah, you're going to have little kids on the playground wearing Cleveland Browns, Deshaun Watson jerseys, playing quarterback, dreaming of a future in the NFL. And who's going to be the one that's explaining to them what this individual is alleged to have done?
Exactly.
It's not going to be owner Jimmy Haslam or, GM Andrew Berry. It's going to be the parents. And are they going to explain it? Who knows?
Yeah, I know. And it's for parents, I'm not saying this is the rule for all parents, because I think there are a lot of progressive people out there now who will talk about things like this with their kids, because I think talking about it with people is the way to go. It's uncomfortable, but I think it needs to be talked about. Let's normalize having these hard conversations.
Exactly.
But how can Deshaun Watson be a role model for people if his personal life isn't something worth looking up to?
Absolutely. And I think this whole conversation leads perfectly into the next question and everything. We've kind of built the flow around that. But moving into the third question here. So the trade is made. Deshaun Watson is now a member of the Cleveland Browns. Let's hop into the fandom flipper. Going to need a little sounder for that. And where, for the moment, we're Cleveland Browns fans. Deshaun Watson is acquired for 3 first-round picks, 1 third-round pick, and 2 fourth-round picks. The news is announced on a Friday afternoon, which is notable for a reason I'll dive into more in a second. But Kate, what are our thoughts as, for the moment, Cleveland Brown fans?
As a, for the moment, Browns fan, I'm uncomfortable about this choice. And truthfully, I don't support it. There's so many talented people out there. And I know maybe he's a little bit better than anyone else who was available at the time. But I don't see why choosing someone with 23 allegations of sexual assault and giving him a huge contract is worth it.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point. There are many talented people out there, but the NFL definitely has a very weak spot for certain positions and talented individuals. Had Deshaun Watson been a different player at a different position, let's say he's a defensive tackle, let's say he's on the offensive line, I'm not saying that this is right, but that might have led to him being excommunicated from the league. Since he plays quarterback and the league can't even find 32 individuals that are super ultra talented. Everybody's always looking for that top 10 guy. And if you don't have one of those guys, you're very frustrated. And the next question is going to lead into the frustration of the Browns. It still doesn't make an action like this right, but it begins to bring some of the context to why the move occurred. And I think you brought up an excellent point in the previous question. My heart and my mind is continually thinking about the NFL fans and the viewers, especially the young kids and, newer fans to the sport watching the Browns. The Browns sold their soul to try and win. They're going for it all. They're going for a championship. And at what cost? For the moment, like you said, Browns fan, honestly, I'm out. I don't really care if they win the Super Bowl this year. Even going to a Super Bowl party or watching the Super Bowl is going to be an immensely less enjoyable experience if you have to watch a quarterback that has this history and these allegations surrounding him. I don't think that the Browns thought this decision out fan-wise. I think they were blinded by their desperation and their greed. And I want to return back and hear your thoughts on this as well, because I think this was a brilliant strategy, but also extremely icky. But around the NFL's Dan Hanzus called out that this news would be dropped on a Friday afternoon. And that's exactly what they did. So that the news over the weekend would pile up, people would go about their lives. And then this story and the backlash would become a victim of our short attention span. Drop it on the Friday. people have the whole weekend and news has the whole weekend to pile up, and it's an afterthought by Monday morning.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting strategy. I know if it was dropped through the week, a lot of people work jobs Monday to Friday. And if you're really into football, I'm sure you have, I don't know, maybe people you work with or people you see through the week that you'd be like, oh, how did you see this? And then you'd have a conversation about it. But if it's dropped on a Friday and you're home for the weekend and maybe not seeing as many people, you're not going to talk about it as much, I don't think.
No, absolutely not. And before we exit the fandom flipper, do you have any last comments about a team that you sort of envision for your fandom?
Yeah, I personally wanted the team I cheer for to be full of individuals that have similar values to me. I know this isn't the case for everyone, and I'm sure there are people out there who care more about an athlete's talent and how they perform on the field. But yeah, I like feeling like I'm getting to know players. The more I see them interacting with their community, or the more I see them giving back to their community. And I really do find it hard to want to cheer for a team that only cares about winning and will do anything to get to the top.
Yeah, and I want to make it clear here that our goal is not to disparage the NFL, but it is to illuminate that there is an issue here. This sliding scale of talent versus crime is an issue that needs to be fixed. And we've taken some steps, if we can say that, as NFL fans and the NFL in general has taken steps in order to emphasize the work in the community, as you noted. During the year, one of the most celebrated and publicized awards is the Walter Payton Man of the Year Award. And that award goes to a person that is giving back to their community, that are involved, that's making true change. And this year, notably, the Colts, Kenny Moore. Kenny Moore is a player that I would love to see kids running around with Moore the second on the back of their jerseys and, playing cornerback and trying to cover. And then also noting that he makes such a difference in the Indianapolis community. So we can kind of end that question on a good note with our boy Kenny there. Now, turning our attention to what is, in my opinion, the grossest part of this discussion, the new contract that was given to Deshaun Watson. So for context, let's recall that the Browns have been the joke of the league for decades, ranging from controversies with their owner, Jimmy Haslam, that I'll let y'all research on your own time, to their 0-16 season, which then led to the drafting of their quarterback savior, Baker Mayfield. This is painting the picture of a franchise desperate to get over the proverbial hump. And to do that, they seem to have sold their soul. They tasted success with Baker, and then the relationship soured as they pursued Watson. And at one point, the decision was narrowed down to the Falcons and the Saints. The Browns were the first team declared out of these controversial sweepstakes. So the Browns do the unthinkable. They offer a fully guaranteed 5-year, $230 million contract to Watson, which is $80 million more than the previous record for guaranteed money per rap sheet.
Gross.
Kate, I couldn't agree more. And I know that you don't have too many comments on this. I mean, lack of a question was more of a statement, but I just wanted to highlight this because when you delve into the contract and you look at the amounts that are being paid out, the first thing that you're going to notice is that the contract only pays out roughly $1 million this year, which the Browns would offer backloads the contract so that they are able to bring in more free agents this year. What the rest of us have astutely noticed is that it's only backloaded or pushed back 1 year so that Watson isn't going to miss out on much money when he inevitably gets suspended. And I think that's one of the most disgusting parts of this story. So we bring in this individual with this history and this story and these allegations. We give him a record-setting contract, no punishment for his actions there. He may or may not be suspended. oh darn. And we're going to make sure that he doesn't miss out on any of his hugely guaranteed money, because we were out of the sweepstakes. And the only way the only way for the Browns to get back in on the sweepstakes is to try to get him more money to come to the Browns. Ian Rappaport posts that in his most direct comments on the legal situation yet during the Browns press conference, Deshaun Watson says, "I understand the seriousness of the allegations. I've never assaulted a single woman. I've never disrespected any woman." Later, he says, "I've never done the things that people are alleging." Now, Kate, to bring you back into the conversation here, I want to read a tweet from, and I got to see if I can get this last name right, Michelle Magdeswick here. "Someone needs to ask Deshaun Watson to provide one single reason why any human would need to go to over 50 different masseuses in a matter of a couple years. Why could you never find one good one to keep if you were acting normal? No other player in sport has come out to say if that's normal."
Yeah. I mean, I know people maybe need to go through a couple of masseuses to find one that they like everyone has a different style. Everyone gives a different experience. So maybe going through a couple, like let's say 5 maybe is normal. But yeah, 50 in how long? 2 years? Like that's more than 2 new masseuses a month. It's strange.
It's strange, at least. And then when you see that these allegations are coming out, then it starts to connect the dots. And then you fast forward throughout this whole negotiation process, or this sort of process of trying to find him a new home. This $230 million is given to a person who pled the fifth when questioned about these allegations. And just this past week, I believe he was ordered by a judge to answer questions about his sexual conduct with these individuals. The contract itself is definitely one of the parts that I'm struggling with the most. It doesn't paint, especially the Browns, with a positive light. And it further alludes to, if we're going to go back to the fandom flipper, why I would never find myself as a Cleveland Browns fan. Now, let's move on to the next question. Kate, I understand you have something ready for me. Hit me.
I do. Are you ready for my new segment that I just made up now?
Oh, yeah.
It's Kate's Q's, rapid fire edition.
Ooh, I like it.
All right. Are you ready?
Yep. Hit me.
Okay. Deshaun Watson will be suspended, right?
Yes, it is in my opinion that he will be. I think the precedent for a lot of these suspensions of domestic abuse, sexual assault, I would put the minimum at 6 games. But as I noted before, that's in contrast to an entire indefinite suspension that was received by somebody who was just gambling. I also believe that while this all gets resolved, he could and most likely will be placed on the commissioner's exempt list. Now,
Owen, what's the commissioner's exempt list?
I love that you called that out, Kate. Before the pod, and now being included on the pod, I asked Kate to call out any terms or anything like that related to fantasy football or football in general that the audience needs to understand. So the NFL's personal conduct policy gives League Commissioner Roger Goodell the ability to place a player on an exempt list that essentially puts him on paid administrative leave. So these players aren't going to count towards a team's active roster. So he still get paid. And now that we're talking about this and we just finished talking about the contract, wouldn't it be wonderful if he was placed on the commissioner's exempt list for this year so that he still got his $1 million? And then the next year, when he's going to be paid his $40 million, that's when we suspend him. I mean, it's still just a little bit, but at least it's something.
Yeah.
So, yeah, to sum up, my gut says 6 games is the minimum, but I'm hoping for indefinite.
All right. Next question. What is the precedent for a suspension for a player accused of sexual assault or in trouble with the law in general?
Ooh, I think I already covered this one. So I'm going to say...
You kind of did.
So I'm going to say 6 games, but there's also appeals and everything else that can occur. So this is not going to be a short process.
All right. How are the Browns setting themselves up to be without Watson?
That's a great question, Kate. So earlier in free agency, the Cleveland Browns signed Jacoby Brissett, which is actually a bit of a breath of fresh air after talking about Deshaun Watson for so long. Jacoby Brissett, famously an ex-starter of the Indianapolis Colts. Kate always enjoyed yelling out Jacoby every time he was shown on camera. But in contrast to Watson, this is a player that has immense respect and immense positivity from all around the league, from players, coaches, talking about his leadership and him as a human being. So they signed Jacoby Brissett. He's going to be their starter. And then now recently, they also signed Josh Dobbs, an ex-Steeler quarterback, which will form, while Watson is suspended or on the commissioner's exempt list, a starter backup tandem that ideally won't sink the team. Also note that Baker Mayfield is still on the roster, but regardless of anything that comes out, he's not going to be on the roster. He's done with the Browns.
Okay. And last question, how can we, as smart fantasy football players, account for this suspension?
So we're going to get into the fantasy football side of all of this in a second. I'm going to ask a question and Kate's going to ask a question, but it's important to note that you can account for the suspension if it's 6 games by placing Watson on injured reserve slots where it's eligible. This is one of the parts of fantasy that sometimes slips by people. But for instance, last year, Will Fuller was suspended for performance enhancing drugs, suspended for 1 game. But if you were able to take him in the later rounds of fantasy football drafts and then stash him on your injured reserve, and again, you have to know your league. You have to know if suspended players are eligible for injured reserve slots. But if you could stash him in there, you potentially have a top 5 quarterback for when he returns. Now, are you going to want to do that? That's a good question. So we're now venturing into the reality of Deshaun Watson becoming a fantasy football asset once again. The audience doesn't know this, but Kate, you and I had a failed attempt at recording a podcast about this topic a little while ago. And with this being take 2, where I was able to work on the flow of the podcast more, and both of us are able to think and reflect on the first one and provide more thoughtful and clear responses on a topic that definitely deserves it. So returning back to that. So on this not to be released podcast, I mentioned an idea that as fantasy players, if we draft Watson, we would donate to a local women's shelter when we do so. Now, this is definitely an example of a time where I'm going to use some growth mindset, as this is a mistake that I can learn from and adjust my thoughts and actions going forward. But Kate, before I continue rambling here, do you want to share your response that you had to this idea?
Yeah. First of all, your idea of the donation in general is a great idea. I'm like, no matter the circumstance, I think that's a great idea. But what I questioned on our first attempt was, how is putting him on your fantasy team any different than the Browns signing him to their team? I mean, if you don't agree with the Browns having him on their roster, how are you okay with him being on your fantasy team? No judgment if you want him on your team, but I think that just takes us back to wanting to win at all costs, right?
Yes. And that's exactly what you said the first time. And it kind of stopped me dead in my tracks because, Kate, you're absolutely right. I think as fantasy football players, we need to step back and think about the decision that we are going to make by adding Deshaun Watson to our fantasy teams. I think the most important question is that, are there other options? And there are. There are other top 5 quarterbacks, other top 10 quarterbacks. And say, fast forward to next year when Deshaun Watson isn't suspended, let's say. I think that even if he's a value with where he's being drafted, I think he's a player that should forever be off my draft board personally, because Kate makes an excellent point. It's not worth winning with that type of player on your team. Yes, It's great to win. But again, I mentioned earlier, think about the Super Bowl with Deshaun Watson in it. Is that going to be an enjoyable experience to watch, to cheer for? No. So do yourself a favor, in my opinion, draft someone else that you can get excited for and cheer for.
Wise words.
Well, wise words upon reflection.
Yes.
And you made an excellent point earlier too, where it's important to have these uncomfortable conversations, and it's important to learn and to grow from them. And I appreciate you as both my podcast partner and my life partner calling that out and helping me through it.
Anytime.
Kate, you have another question for me?
All right. So, Owen, with that being said, what are the fantasy implications for the Texans, first of all, and the Browns?
Now, I did forget to put notes in here on the Texans. So I'm going to be flying by the seat of my pants on that side of this question, but you ask an excellent question. So you said the Texans first of all, but I'm going to disregard that part and I'm just going to jump right into the Browns because I do what I want. So it means that there's another top 12, and we said top 5 quarterback available to draft. Now, again, note the suspension. Note that you could draft this player and put him into an injured reserve slot if your league allows for that. Note that you're making the decision to put this player on your fantasy football roster, as we've discussed ad nauseum. But also recall that Watson finished after his rookie year, finished as quarterback 5, quarterback 4, and quarterback 4 overall. I'm not going to sit here and tell you not to draft him, just like I won't tell you not to cheer for the Browns, because he is a valuable asset in fantasy and he's a valuable asset to the Browns. More positively, it means Jacoby time during the suspension. Jacoby time. Sorry, I had to hit that one more time. Jacoby can support a number 1 receiver. In his only full year as a starter, Brissett propelled T.Y. Hilton to a wide receiver 24 overall finished, but this was notably after the Colts traded for him almost on the eve of the season. He also started an almost entire season in 2019 with the Colts, but there wasn't a fantasy viable receiver on the Colts that year. It was mostly split between Zach Pascal and T.Y. Hilton, but you had injuries running rampant among the Colts, so that might not be the best barometer. He also played last year, and you can look up stats for yourself, but it's hard to believe that the Dolphins are going to be an instance of something that we can learn from for this year. Brissett definitely looked up and down at times, but returning back to the question, for the skill positions, I believe that Amari Cooper is viable. I do not think that he is a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy football. I don't think he's even necessarily a top 24. With Brissett, I think he falls outside of that top 24. So you would be drafting him as a wide receiver 3 or 4 on your team. So keep that in mind. And all of the other receiving options, from Donovan Peoples-Jones to David Njoku, who was recently franchise tagged. And if you're thinking, why is David Njoku the tight end 1 there now? Austin Hooper was released. That was noted on the previous podcast with Joel, and ended up with the Titans. And Watson rarely uses the tight ends, at least from the data of the lackluster tight ends he had in Houston. So Amari Cooper, wide receiver 3 sort of area. Donovan Peoples-Jones and other wide receivers, you can scrap them from your draft boards. Njoku, scrap from your draft boards. And then we turn our attention to the backfield. Nick Chubb is probably going to benefit from the acquisition of a dual threat quarterback. We can see that with Lamar Jackson as his running back partners in the backfield pile up stats, whether it be just rushing yards or touchdowns. But that's not going to be the case while Watson is either on the exempt list or suspended. So I would think that the Browns would continue to feature their running back heavy approach, which would make Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt very valuable fantasy assets. Chubb is still going to be the primary runner, and it's almost sad that Kareem Hunt is in this backfield because I would love to see what Nick Chubb can do without Kareem Hunt there. If Kareem Hunt was ever traded or released from the Browns, I would just like to note here first and foremost that Nick Chubb would probably be my running back one, debatably over Jonathan Taylor, which I know is a bit of a shocking thing to hear for those of you that know me. But Nick Chubb is still going to be a round 1, round 2 drafted running back, definitely a top 10 running back for fantasy. And Kareem Hunt is definitely still going to have value. I'd strongly recommend drafting him later, as he will continue to hold standalone value as the Browns use him to salt away games and they don't want to overuse Nick Chubb, and that's fantastic. And Hunt would immediately become a top 10 fantasy running back in the event of a Nick Chubb injury. Now, with that being said, I'd like to rewind back to the Deshaun Watson conversation just for a second here. And I'd also like to note that the Deshaun Watson situation reminds me of the Kareem Hunt acquisition by the Browns, as he was acquired by the Browns on the heels of his own controversy. While he was on the Chiefs, a video of Kareem Hunt beating and kicking a woman in 2018 emerged, and he was cut. You might ask, why didn't that cause as much news and backlash as Watson? Well, like the previous question, we've learned a lot since then. And as I've noted, I won't be cheering for the Browns, and I'll even go as far right now as to say that Kareem Hunt won't be on any of my fantasy football teams this year, akin to how Deshaun Watson won't be, for the reasons that Kate has illuminated for me as well. Now, returning to the Texans now. So the Texans have absolved themselves of this quarterback situation. We can all breathe a deep breath and move on to a new era in Houston, much to the chagrin of Indianapolis Colts fans. But the current starting quarterback of the Texans is Davis Mills. And Davis Mills is a 3rd round pick last year who wasn't really expected to be anything special, but actually turned out to be a pretty great quarterback for his draft position, especially after being drafted after the top quarterbacks available last year. He was able to sustain Brandon Cooks, and Brandon Cooks, as the wide receiver, was given a 2-year extension after some of the trade rumors were emerging. So I think that Brandon Cooks is likely your only fantasy viable wide receiver option from this team. And just remember in your drafts that Brandon Cooks might be the best value wide receiver each and every year. Brandon Cooks always averages over 1,000 yards. He's finally settled down to a spot in Houston. He's got a quarterback that can sustain him. The Texans might reinvest in a quarterback and bring an even better one in. But for now, Brandon Cooks in the later rounds, he holds the value of a wide receiver, of at least a top 24 wide receiver, if not more. I picked him up in probably the 14th or 15th round of my home league's fantasy football draft last year, and he was a top 10 wide receiver for the majority of the year. Another wide receiver to keep an eye on in Houston is Nico Collins. He was a later round draft pick, but has the profile of a player that can be successful in the league. I don't believe he'll be fantasy viable, but just another interesting player to watch. I'm not going to ask Kate at the end of this interview to tell us a fantasy player that we all need to be aware of, because she's just beginning her journey into fantasy football. So in lieu of that, watch Nico Collins. Really interesting player. I think he's got a lot of talent, and that's coming from a Colts fan. And then you turn your attention to the backfield, where Rex Burkhead emerged as running back 1 last year. But during the offseason, the Texans have gone out and signed former Indianapolis Colts running back Marlon Mack. Marlon Mack is a continually underrated running back in the NFL, and one that can hold fantasy value. So we're going to watch over the offseason to see how this backfield shakes out between Marlon Mack, between the ghost of David Johnson, and between Rex Burkhead. At this point, I'm recommending adding Burkhead because they gave him that contract before the end of the year, which signifies that he is valued by the team and will hold value in fantasy in the coming season. But Marlon Mack is a dual threat in terms of running and pass catching ability. And I would look for him in the top 36 should he get the starting role to himself. If I had to make the decision right now, Kate, I know you really want to know, but if I had to make the decision right now, I would just say abstain from the entire Texans backfield. Take a shot in your second to last or last round at one of these running backs and hope that you strike gold. This could be a backfield that you could capitalize for a zero running back approach in your drafts where you go wide receiver heavy at the start and you need to pick up a potential starter later on. Kate, did that answer your question?
It sure did. Thanks. It sure did.
Do you have any thoughts to add on the fantasy implications?
No, I think you covered everything that was on my mind.
That's a brilliant answer. That's a great interview response there, Kate. So I don't want everybody to leave here on the heels of me rambling for however long that was about the fantasy implications. I hope you jotted down some notes, learned some stuff about that. But again, we'll have to keep an eye on both of these teams as these situations resolve themselves in terms of the Watson suspension and the backfield and the depth chart. But Kate, again, in lieu of a fantasy player that we can keep, a lesser known fantasy player that we can keep our eyes on, who are some of the players in the NFL that in your beginning journey, you've really enjoyed watching or you've really connected with? You mentioned that being involved in the community is a really important part of what you look for in a football player.
Well, thanks to Hard Knocks, when they featured the Colts, Kenny Moore is just a really great person overall outside of football. And it's been cool to watch him on the field too, because he has some great talent.
Yeah. I mean, you can definitely notice Kenny out there on the field. You want to look for one of the less height inclined individuals on the field, but one that plays with fire, absolute tenacity, and has really locked down that slot corner position. That's an important one in the league.
Yeah. I also really love Darius Leonard. I mean, have you seen his arms?
Now, to be clear, Kate, you're not referencing the muscles, although spends a lot of time in the weight room.
Oh, no, I am not referencing the muscles. I'm referencing the wingspan on that guy.
And okay, so you're watching a Colts game, and like I said, watch Kenny Moore, very exciting. But then I bet that your attention, anybody's attention, will be drawn from Kenny Moore to, as you mentioned, this linebacker with the longest arms that Kate and I have ever seen on an individual. It's hard to imagine how anybody ever gets around Darius.
Yeah. And I mean, he's not only really great at what he does, but watching him on the sidelines is really cool too, because he's such a leader and he's always hyped for his team and he seems very supportive of everyone. So, you know, I just love those people that I feel I can connect more with because they let you get to know them as a person outside of football.
Absolutely. And you mentioned outside of football and you mentioned the sidelines too. Darius is nicknamed the Maniac. And on game days, you can definitely see this side of his personality coming out on game day where he is the maniac. He's a little crazy. He's a little in your face. He's a little brash. But if you follow him on Instagram, you can see a family man, a girl dad.
Yeah.
And just a happy individual that's out serving his community too.
Yeah. And he's always, he always wants to push himself further. He always wants to show up harder than he did the day before. So I think that's really cool. Like he earned his spot as a professional athlete and it's cool to watch him.
He did. And Darius, especially, he took a screenshot of the news report after his draft. And I think I've mentioned this to you before, Kate, but it's a good reminder and a good little nugget for the audience, where Darius took a screenshot of multiple reports from multiple places after the NFL draft that he was the worst second round pick that has been made in history. Well, turns out he was the best second round pick that's ever been made in history. Well, maybe Colts history. And I could recite all of his stats, but I mean, you just got to watch him. He's a game changer. When he's not on the field, the Colts notice. And I think it's really funny that you mentioned both Kenny and Darius, as they've been campaigning for a lot of the free agents to come join the Colts. And I got to say, it's got me excited for the NFL season. Well, Kate, on that note, do you have any words of wisdom or positivity to get us out on after a difficult, to say the least, topic?
Always trust your gut. Have the difficult conversations. Don't shy away from having the difficult conversations, even when it feels uncomfortable, because I think we all learn something when we do talk about topics like this.
And then we can come together as a more positive, inclusive, and understanding world.
Exactly. Let's normalize these conversations and normalize getting uncomfortable.
Absolutely. So I just want to thank you, Kate, for being a part of 2 podcasts in one. I think this one went much more swimmingly than our first attempt. It was a little bit rushed on my part and a little bit choppy in terms of the flow. And I hope that the audience got a lot out of this, learned a lot. And I just want to thank you again for your time. Just blessed to be on a podcast that I've created with my lovely girlfriend.
Hashtag blessed.
All right, Kate, we out.
Peace.
Okay, everybody, we're done here for today. You're gonna want to listen to the next episode of the official 1-0 Fantasy Football Podcast. O-Dog, out.
Welcome to the outtakes.
All right.
Also,
and what are we? Uh-oh.
Okay. Now I just want to check the levels on these other ones. Humor me.
Test. Who's there? I don't know what I'm saying.
I mean, just imagine you just walk through the door. I'll give you the door sounder again, okay?
Hashtag blessed. Hey, Owen. Hi. Is that when you wanted me to talk? I thought you were doing the music.
I almost have to keep my eyes like this the whole time.
Why?
I don't know, to look at my screen.
I don't even know what I was saying. I don't know what to say.
I'm feeling it. You ready?
Ready, Fred? It sounds wonderful.
Jacoby time.
All right. Let's do that. Say that again, because I said all right at the same time.
Kate, you forget that it records separately, right?
Oh, I didn't know.
So I'll just cut you out.
Oh, okay.
That's a good little blurb too.
Are someday hoping to be in the NFL playing even... Nope.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, I'm muting myself. Bye.
No yawning during the intro. Want to know on 3? 1, 2, 3.
Want to know?
Now, Kate, do you know what the can you hit me with a Oh, and what's the commissioner's exempt list?
Owen, what's the commissioner's exempt list? One person alleges someone who maybe a professional alleges. Is that even a word?
Makes an allegation.
Okay. Teams want to go to the Super Bowl. That's the whole end goal of the. Oh my gosh.
Super loud. Is it loud for you?
Yep.
I just didn't know if I still have my volume cranked. That's a brilliant answer. That's an interview. That's a presser interview. Wow, that was like an electrolyte cookie at the bottom of that one.
An electrolyte cookie. Yeah. Also, sorry.
If people listen this long, they're fine with it. You're nuts.
No, you're nuts.
No, you're nuts.
The end. Poof. Owen was gone.